A single tanker sits in darkness somewhere in the Gulf of Oman. No flag, no transponder signal. Its IAS tracker went dark 3 days ago, somewhere between the Iranian terminal at Karg Island and a rendezvous point that does not appear on any published shipping schedule. Inside its hull, roughly 2 million barrels of Iranian crude, and the price agreed for that cargo is somewhere between $8 and $15. Below the international Brent benchmark, a discount so steep that almost no legitimate buyer in the open market would need it. Almost. That cargo is heading to a Chinese port, and the money it generates, discounted, sanctioned, technically illegal under US Treasury rules, will quietly flow back through a network of shell companies, front firms, and intermediary banks until a portion of it reaches the operational budgets of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The IRGC does not publish its accounts, but the fast boats patrolling the Strait of Hormuz need fuel. The Shahed 136 drones launched from coastal batteries need components. The naval mines laid in shipping lanes need someone to buy them, someone to position them, and someone to decide when to use them. That someone is funded, in part, by the barrel of oil you just watched disappear into the dark. Here is the question, without a clean answer. The United States and its partners have spent years tightening a sanctions regime specifically designed to stop exactly this. Ships get turned back. Terminals get blacklisted. Banks get cut off from SWIFT. And yet the oil keeps moving. Not at full volume, not at full price, but enough. Enough to matter. Enough to keep the pressure on. So what is actually happening here? Why does selling oil at a loss still fund a military campaign? And why does the blockade keep running into a wall it cannot quite break through? Stay with this, because the answer is not what most people expect. The math is stranger than the politics, and the math is what actually sets the limits on both sides. To understand why discounted Iranian oil still pays for a war, you have to go back to a number that does not change regardless of the sanctions. The cost of the hardware being purchased with that revenue. A Shahed 136 loitering munition. The drone that Iran has manufactured by the thousands. The drone that showed up over Ukrainian cities and over Red Sea shipping lanes. Costs somewhere between $20,000 and $50,000 per unit depending on the production run and the components sourced. Compare that to the SM-6 interceptor missile that a US destroyer fires to bring one down, roughly $4.1 million per shot. That gap, a factor of 80 to 100, is not an accident of engineering. It is the entire strategic logic of what Iran is doing in the Gulf. The IRGC does not need to win a conventional naval battle against the United States Navy. It needs to exist. It needs to be present, threatening, capable of raising the cost of passage through the Strait of Hormuz high enough that every tanker operator, every insurance underwriter, every shipping company routing crude through that water has to factor in a risk premium. That premium ripples across the global oil price in ways that have nothing to do with how many barrels Iran itself exports. This asymmetry is something Ali Khamenei's strategists have understood for decades and that Washington continues to find uncomfortable. Iran does not need to be rich to be dangerous. It needs to be cheap enough to sustain the threat and expensive enough for its opponents to respond to. Now layer the oil economics on top of that. Iran's proven oil reserves sit at roughly 209 billion barrels, among the largest in the world. Under normal market conditions, the country was capable of exporting somewhere between 2 and 2.5 million barrels per day before the tightest rounds of US sanctions began cutting into that figure after 2018. By the early 2020s, official estimates from the US Energy Information Administration and the International Energy Agency put Iranian exports at somewhere between 500,000 and 1.4 million barrels per day, a wide range because a significant portion of those exports were moving through channels specifically designed not to be measured. The shadow fleet is not a metaphor, it is a physical infrastructure, tankers with doctored documents, ship-to-ship transfers in international waters that move crude from Iranian-flagged vessels to third-country ships with cleaner paper trails. Port calls in intermediate countries, Malaysia, the UAE, Oman, where the oil gets relabeled, blended with other crude, and enters the global market as something other than what it is. The people running this infrastructure are not ideologues. They are logistics professionals who take a cut, and the cut is funded by the discount. Here is the arithmetic of the discount. If Iran sells a barrel at $12 below Brent, it gives up $12 in revenue per barrel. But if the alternative is selling 0 barrels, because legitimate buyers will not touch sanctioned crude at any price, then selling at a steep discount is not a loss, it is an optimization. The marginal revenue on a barrel that would otherwise sit in a tank on Karg Island is 0. Any price above 0 is better than 0. At 1 million barrels per day, a conservative mid-range estimate for actual shadow fleet exports in recent periods, and at a discount of $10 to $15 below benchmark, Iran clears somewhere in the range of $50 to $70 per barrel on crude that was trading around $80 Brent. That produces a daily revenue figure in the range of $50 to $70 million. Not the $100+ million it would earn at open market prices, but $50 to $70 million a day is not a country being strangled. It is a country being squeezed. There is a difference, and the difference matters for every military calculation being made in Washington and Tehran right now. And there is one buyer absorbing the overwhelming bulk of that discounted flow, and that buyer is China. The concentration is not subtle. When you map Iranian crude exports by destination, the picture is not a diversified market of balanced regional buyers. It is a donut chart where one segment consumes everything else. Chinese refineries, particularly independent operators sometimes called teapot. Refineries in Shandong province have become the primary channel through which sanctioned Iranian crude reaches the global economy. These facilities are not major state-owned enterprises with diplomatic exposure to Washington. They are smaller, privately operated, and significantly less worried about secondary sanctions than a Chinese national oil company would be. The relationship with Beijing and Tehran on this point is not a formal alliance. It is a transaction that happens to serve both parties. China gets oil below market price, a discount that improves the margin on every barrel it processes. Iran gets revenue that would not exist otherwise. Xi Jinping does not need to publicly endorse Iranian military operations in the Gulf to make this arrangement function. He simply needs to not stop it, and that is what he has chosen to do. Here is the part that does not make sense on the surface. The United States has enormous leverage over China through trade, technology, and financial exposure. Leverage that, if applied systematically to the oil question, could theoretically cut the revenue line far more effectively than any naval blockade. And yet the secondary sanctions regime, the mechanism that would penalize Chinese institutions for buying Iranian oil, has been applied inconsistently, with enough carve-outs and diplomatic hedging that the teapot refineries have largely continued operating. The reason for that inconsistency is not a mystery. Fully aggressive secondary sanctions enforcement against Chinese oil buyers risks a confrontation with Beijing across every other dimension of the US-China relationship simultaneously. Trade negotiations, Taiwan posture, technology export controls, currency arrangements. President Donald Trump, whose administration reimposed maximum pressure sanctions on Iran and has repeatedly threatened secondary measures against Chinese buyers, faces the same structural problem every administration before him faced. The cure for the oil revenue. Problem may be more expensive than the disease, depending on which set of costs you are counting. This is the first obstacle the blockade strategy runs into, and it is not a military obstacle, it is a political one. The tools exist, the will to use them fully, consistently, and at the cost of the broader US-China relationship has never quite materialized. I spent time going through the Treasury Department's designation records over the past 3 years, and one pattern kept coming back. The entities sanctioned for facilitating Iranian oil sales are almost always mid-tier. Shipping companies, insurance intermediaries, obscure trading firms registered in Hong Kong or the UAE. The large Chinese refinery groups appear on the list far less frequently than their actual purchase volumes would suggest. The enforcement is real, but it is calibrated. And calibrated enforcement is the gap through which the shadow fleet keeps sailing. Now set the China question aside for a moment and look at what the blockade is actually achieving on the volume side, because the numbers there tell a story that is more complicated than either side wants to admit. When the United States, working with allies and partners, manages to turn back a significant tranche of shadow fleet tankers through naval interception, port denial, insurance blacklisting, or diplomatic pressure on intermediate transit countries, the effect on Iranian export volume is real. Ships carrying Iranian crude have been turned away from Malaysian anchorages. Vessels have been seized or sanctioned mid-voyage. Port operators in the UAE have faced pressure to refuse calls from ships on watch lists. In one period tracked by shipping intelligence firm Kepler, a concentrated enforcement push reduced identifiable Iranian crude flows by somewhere in the range of 200,000 to 300,000 barrels per day over several months. That is not nothing. At $50 to $60 per barrel net revenue, that is $10 to $18 million per day removed from the revenue line. But here is what happens to the price dynamics when you do that. Every time a significant quantity of Iranian crude is removed from the global market, whether through genuine production disruption or enforcement, driven export suppression, the global oil price tends to move upward. Not always dramatically, not always immediately, But the correlation is consistent enough that markets price in the risk before the enforcement even takes effect. When Trump's administration moved to bring Iranian exports to zero in 2019 and granted no waivers to major importers, Brent crude spiked toward $80 before the market recalibrated around the fact that Saudi Arabia would compensate. When tensions in the Strait of Hormuz escalate, when URGC fast boats shadow US destroyers, when mines appear in shipping lanes, when Shahed drones track tankers, the risk premium embedded in the global price rises, and every producer outside Iran captures that premium. Every barrel Saudi Aramco sells at an elevated price because the market is pricing in Gulf risk is in a narrow set, subsidized by the confrontation Iran is sustaining. Russia, which is also operating under sanctions, and also selling discounted crude to Asian buyers, benefits from the same dynamic. The countries whose economies are most damaged by a high oil price are not the producers in the fight. They are the importers outside it. India, Japan, South Korea, Germany, Turkey. Countries whose industrial sectors run on the crude passing through. Hormuz. What this tells us about the structure of this conflict. The costs of the fight are not symmetrically distributed between the two sides doing the fighting. They are heavily distributed onto third parties who have no vote in how the fight is conducted. That is not a new observation, but it is one that gets underweighted in the standard Washington framing of maximum pressure as a costless instrument of statecraft. Put yourself in the position of a Japanese Trade Ministry official for a moment. Japan imports roughly 90% of its crude. A meaningful portion of that crude transits the Strait of Hormuz. When URGC fast boats or mines create a risk premium on Gulf passage, Japanese companies pay higher energy costs. Japanese manufacturers pass those costs into their export prices, and the competitive position of Japanese industry in global markets erodes. Japan is not a party to the US-Iran confrontation. It has no seat at the table where decisions about sanctions enforcement or naval posture are made. And yet it absorbs a real fraction of the economic consequence every time the confrontation heats up. The same calculation runs through India, which has historically been one of Iran's largest oil customers and which has navigated the sanctions regime with a pragmatism that Washington has sometimes found difficult to manage. India reduced its Iranian purchases dramatically after 2019 when the US ended sanction waivers, and Indian refineries felt the adjustment. When the question of resuming Iranian imports came back onto the table, as it periodically does when the diplomatic temperature shifts, Indian officials were not asking an ideological question. They were asking a cost-benefit question. What is the price of compliance with US secondary sanctions versus the price of the cheaper Iranian barrel? The answer to that question changes depending on where Brent is trading, what the discount is, and how aggressively the US Treasury is actually enforcing secondary measures in a given period. That variability is itself a form of market signal, and sophisticated buyers, including Chinese teapot refineries and Indian state refiners, read it carefully. So here is where the two pressure systems meet and where the real dilemma becomes visible. The US and its partners can tighten the blockade. They can intercept more shadow fleet tankers, sanction more shell companies, press harder on intermediate transit ports, and threaten more aggressive secondary measures against Chinese buyers. If they do this consistently enough, and that consistently is doing a lot of work in that sentence, they reduce Iranian export volume and therefore Iranian revenue. The IRGC's operational budget comes under greater pressure. The procurement of Shahed 136 components, the maintenance of fast boat fleets, the wages of naval mine technicians, all of these face tighter constraints. But the tighter the squeeze on Iranian supply, the higher the global oil price risk. And a global oil price spike does not discriminate based on who caused it. It hits American consumers at the pump. It hits European manufacturing. It hits the Asian importers who are supposed to be Washington's partners in containing Beijing. It potentially strengthens Russia's fiscal position at a moment when Washington is trying to weaken it. And it enriches every Gulf producer outside Iran, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, at a rate that arguably reduces their incentive to fully cooperate with the maximum pressure strategy, because the higher price is good for their budgets. Worthy saying plainly, the structure of the global oil market means that maximum pressure on Iran's exports, if successful, functionally acts as a transfer payment from oil importing allies to oil exporting producers who are not the primary strategic concern. Washington is aware of this. It has been aware of it for years, and it has largely chosen not to say so clearly, because the honest version of the trade-off is politically uncomfortable. Easing the squeeze has its own logic and its own costs. If the enforcement pressure on shadow fleet tankers relaxes, Iranian export volumes recover toward the 2 million barrel per day range. The discount narrows slightly because Iran has more leverage in negotiations with buyers when it has more supply to offer. Revenue to the IRGC increases. The fast boats get better maintenance. Esmail Khani, the commander of the Quds force, after the death of Qasem Soleimani, has more operational funding to work with. The proxy network across Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon and Syria operates with fewer cash constraints. Masoud Pezeshkian, Iran's current president, has publicly positioned himself as open to diplomatic engagement on the nuclear file, which is the formal structure through which sanctions relief has historically been negotiated. But diplomatic engagement on the nuclear file does not automatically translate into a change in IRGC behavior in the Gulf. The IRGC answers to Ali Khamenei, not to Pezeshkian, and Khamenei has been consistent over decades. The Revolutionary Guard's operational posture in the Gulf is a strategic asset independent of whatever negotiations the civilian government is conducting with Europeans or Americans. This is the second major obstacle the blockade strategy runs into. The entity generating the threat, the IRGC, is institutionally insulated from the diplomatic channel through which the sanctions relief would theoretically flow. You can negotiate with Pezeshkian. You cannot reliably bind the IRGC through that negotiation. Washington understands this. The negotiating structure it has nonetheless repeatedly returned to, the JCPOA framework and its successors, is built on the assumption that economic pressure applied to the Iranian state will eventually change IRGC behavior. The historical record on that assumption is, to put it carefully, mixed. Now zoom out to the strait itself, because the geography matters in ways that the financial analysis sometimes obscures. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. The navigable channel, the lane where deep draft tankers can actually transit safely, is roughly 2 miles wide in each direction, with a separation zone in between. Through this geometry moves approximately 17 million barrels of crude per day in normal conditions, roughly 17% of global oil consumption. A USS Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group operating in the Gulf of Oman can project enormous power. It carries FC-18 Super Hornets, E-2D Hawkeye command aircraft, and a full surface action group with Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, equipped with SM-6 interceptors and Tomahawk cruise missiles. The firepower is not in question. But the strait is not a terrain where carrier strike group firepower translates directly into uncontested control. The Iranian coastline is close. IRGC coastal defense batteries, equipped with Fateh 110 anti-ship missiles and Nor cruise missiles, the Iranian-produced variant of the Chinese C-802, can threaten surface ships across the entire width of the strait from fixed and mobile. Launcher positions that are inherently difficult to preemptively neutralize. The Bavar 373 long-range air defense system, Iran's domestically developed answer to the S-300, creates a layered air defense environment over the northern coast that complicates any sustained US strike campaign against those launcher positions. The IRGC Navy's doctrine is not to defeat the US Navy in a conventional engagement. It is to raise the cost of passage high enough and the risk to commercial shipping sufficiently unpredictable that the economic effect, the insurance premium, the routing detour, the delayed cargo, accumulates faster than the US can sustain the political and financial cost of the countermeasure response. Mines are the oldest and cheapest instrument of that doctrine. An Iranian naval mine costs a fraction of what it costs to clear one. During the 1987-1988 tanker war, Iranian mines damaged the supertanker Bridgeton, a vessel traveling under US Navy escort, within days of the escort mission beginning. The USS Samuel B. Roberts was nearly sunk by a mine in 1988. The lesson those incidents taught, that mines in the Gulf can be deployed faster than they can be swept, has not been forgotten by either side. What is most surprising about the current phase of this standoff is not the military balance, which has been roughly stable for years. It is the degree to which the financial flows, the discounted barrels, the shadow fleet logistics, the secondary sanctions enforcement gaps, are actually doing more strategic work than the kinetic threat posturing. The boats and the mines matter, but the tanker sailing dark toward a Chinese port matters more to the sustainability of the IRGC's operational posture than any single military incident in the strait. Which brings us back to the buyers, and specifically to what happens when you trace the discounted barrel all the way to its destination and then ask, where does the money actually land? The short answer is that a portion of it lands in these operational accounts, through a chain of intermediaries that is deliberately constructed to be opaque. The longer answer requires acknowledging that Iran's oil revenue does not flow in a straight line from the wellhead to the weapons procurement office. It moves through the National Iranian Oil Company, through a set of trading intermediaries that have been restructured multiple times, specifically to stay ahead of Treasury designations, through front companies registered in jurisdictions with limited transparency requirements, and eventually through a barter and countertrade system that allows some portion of the value to move in commodities rather than dollars, because dollar-denominated transactions touching the US financial system are the primary enforcement surface that Treasury sanctions actually work on. This is the third obstacle facing the blockade strategy, the one that is hardest to solve without fundamentally restructuring the global financial architecture. The Iranian state has had more than 4 decades of sanctions experience to develop workarounds. The Shadow Fleet is not an improvisation. It is the product of institutional learning accumulated across multiple rounds of maximum pressure, each of which taught Iranian logistics operators something about where the gaps were. Pete Hegseth, as Secretary of Defense, has spoken publicly about the need for a more aggressive military posture in the Gulf as a complement to the sanctions regime. The argument is that credible military threat changes the cost-benefit calculation for both the IRGC's operational decisions and for Chinese buyers. Calculating the risk of secondary sanctions, visible US naval presence, carrier strike groups, submarine deployments, some P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft overhead makes the Shadow Fleet nervous and keeps the IRGC's fast boat commanders from becoming too comfortable. That logic is not wrong as far as it goes, but it does not solve the fundamental problem, which is that the financial flows generating the IRGC's budget are running through a channel. Chinese refinery purchases of discounted Iranian crude, that is not primarily a military problem. It is a financial and diplomatic problem, and the military presence cannot by itself close it. Here is a line from a recent Treasury enforcement action that almost reads like fiction in its specificity. A shell company registered in Oman, using a vessel flagged in Panama, transporting crude that was described in its cargo documents as Malaysian blend, delivered to a port in eastern China where it was sold to an independent refinery, whose ownership traces back through 3 holding companies to a principal who appears on no public watch list. The crude was Iranian, the transaction was sanctioned, the money moved. The enforcement action came 18 months after the cargo was delivered. That 18-month lag is the Shadow Fleet's operating margin. The oil kept moving, the money kept flowing, and then in the spring of 2026, something shifted in the enforcement pattern. Not a dramatic breakthrough, but a change in the tempo and targeting of Treasury designations that began to close some of the intermediate country transit routes that had been the most reliable workaround. Ships that had routinely anchored off Malaysian coasts for ship-to-ship transfers found those anchorages increasingly hostile. UAE port operators, who had been processing calls from vessels on watch lists, began receiving the kind of secondary pressure that had teeth. The volume figures began to move, but the discount moved too. This is the mechanical relationship at the heart of the whole dynamic. When enforcement pressure reduces Iranian export volume, Iran compensates by deepening the discount offered to the buyers who are still willing to take the risk. A deeper discount does 2 things simultaneously. It reduces Iran's per-barrel revenue, which is what the sanctions are designed to achieve. But it also increases the attractiveness of the purchase to the marginal buyer, the teapot refinery, the independent trader, who now sees a wider spread between the prices they are paying and the price they could sell the refined product for. The discount functions as a self-correcting mechanism that partially offsets the volume loss by pulling in buyers who were not previously in the market. The economics do not fully offset the volume loss. At lower volumes and higher discounts, total revenue falls. The question is by how much, and whether the fall is large enough to materially constrain IRGC operations. The answer, at the enforcement intensities achieved so far, appears to be not quite. The IRGC has been operating under financial constraint for years. It has adapted to constraint. The Shahed 136 production cost curve has been driven down through domestic manufacturing scale and component substitution. The fast boat fleet is maintained through Iranian naval engineering rather than imported parts. The mine inventory is produced domestically. The cheap hardware strategy is not just a response to sanctions. It is partly a product of sanctions, because sanctions forced a procurement model that happens to be asymmetrically effective against an opponent whose countermeasure costs are structurally much higher. The human dimension of this financial architecture is not located in Washington or Tehran. It is located in the countries that sit downstream of these decisions, absorbing costs they did not choose and cannot easily avoid. An Indian family running a small manufacturing business in Gujarat pays more for diesel when the Gulf risk premium rises. They did not vote for Trump's maximum pressure policy or for Khamenei's Gulf strategy. They are paying a fraction of the cost of a confrontation they have no power to resolve. Multiply that fraction by the hundreds of millions of people across South and Southeast Asia whose energy costs are indexed, directly or indirectly, to the price of crude moving through the Strait of Hormuz, and the human cost of the financial standoff becomes something other than an abstraction. In Yemen, the Houthi movement, which receives Iranian financial and material support that flows from the same revenue stream we have been tracking, has used that support to continue a campaign that has displaced millions of people and produced one of the most severe humanitarian crises of the past decade. The Houthis' attacks on Red Sea shipping in 2023 and 2024, launched with Shahed variant drones and anti-ship missiles whose components, traced back through Iranian supply chains, forced global shipping operators to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 10 to 14 days and significant cost to cargo transiting between Asia and Europe. The cost of that disruption, paid by shipping companies, passed through to consumers in European and Asian markets, was measured in the billions. It was paid by people who have no relationship to the Iran-US confrontation, beyond the fact that their supply chains run through the same geography that the confrontation occupies. Benjamin Netanyahu, who has his own set of calculations about Iranian power projection that do not always align precisely with Washington's, has made the case that the financial flows sustaining Hezbollah and Hamas trace back through the same oil revenue channel. Israeli intelligence assessments of Iranian proxy funding consistently identify the oil money as the upstream source. The operational logic that applies in the Gulf applies in the Levant. Iran's capacity to sustain proxy pressure on Israel is partly a function of the revenue that discounted crude generates in Chinese refineries thousands of miles from the front lines. So where does this leave the people actually making the decisions? In Washington, the Trump administration faces a choice that is genuinely asymmetric in its costs. Push harder on the shadow fleet, more aggressive secondary sanctions against Chinese buyers, more naval interdiction, more pressure on intermediate transit hubs, and accept the risk of a confrontation with Beijing that could spill into other theaters, plus the oil price spike that would hit American consumers and allied importers. Or hold the pressure at its current calibrated level and accept that Iranian oil revenue, while constrained, is not constrained enough to materially change IRGC behavior. In Tehran, Khamenei's calculation is different but equally constrained. The revenue is real, but it is not enough to fund an escalation to the level that would provoke a decisive US military response. The IRGC's posture is calibrated to stay below the threshold where Washington's political cost of a major strike becomes lower than the political cost of continued tolerance. Esmail Khani manages that calibration at the operational level, keeping the fast boats present, the mines available, the drone inventory replenished, without crossing a line that would change the American decision calculus fundamentally. Mojtaba Khamenei, the Supreme Leader's son and a figure of growing influence inside the system, is understood to be a hawk on Gulf strategy. But even hawks in Tehran understand that the oil revenue being generated by the shadow fleet is the floor under everything else, and you do not blow up the floor. What is interesting about this stalemate is that both sides are correct about their own positions and both are stuck for the same structural reason. The math of the discount sets the limits, not the strategic preferences of either government. Iran cannot voluntarily reduce the discount and maintain the export volumes because buyers will not pay full price for sanctioned crude. It is forced to discount by the enforcement environment. The discount funds the fight. This is not a choice. It is the equilibrium the sanctions regime produces when it achieves partial but not total enforcement. The United States cannot tighten enforcement to the point of zero Iranian exports without accepting costs in Chinese relations, in allied energy prices, in global oil market stability that exceed the benefit of starving the IRGC budget by the last fraction. It is forced to tolerate partial enforcement. The partial enforcement is insufficient to change the equilibrium. This is also not a choice. It is the equilibrium the US political system produces when the cure is more expensive than the disease at the margins. One detail that stuck with me in reviewing the history of this mechanism: in 1995, when the Clinton administration first imposed comprehensive sanctions on Iran, US officials estimated it would take 3 to 5 years for economic pressure to change Iranian behavior. 30 years later, the pressure is tighter and more sophisticated in some ways, looser and more riddled with enforcement gaps in others, and the IRGC's operational posture in the Gulf is functionally continuous with what it was in the late 1990s. The shadow fleet is newer, the drones are cheaper, the discount is steeper, but the structure is the same. The ships at risk in this equation are not abstractions either. The crew members on a tanker transiting the Strait of Hormuz, Filipino able seamen, Indian engineers, Ukrainian officers are not parties to the sanctions dispute or the military standoff. They are workers on a vessel that has been made into a strategic asset by the geography it crosses. When IRGC fast boats shadow a tanker, when a mine appears in a shipping lane, when a Shahed drone is spotted tracking a vessel at night, those crew members are the physical human presence inside the risk calculation. The insurance industry's response to that risk has been to raise war risk premiums on Gulf passages to levels that effectively tax every cargo that moves through the strait, a tax whose proceeds go to Lloyd's of London underwriters, not to any of the parties to the dispute. The Seafarers Union AMEC has repeatedly called for clearer international protection rules for crews operating in contested Gulf waters. Those calls have not produced binding agreements. The gap between the legal framework that governs commercial shipping and the reality of operating inside an active military standoff is one of the quiet costs that the financial and geopolitical analysis tends to overlook. Here is what this tells us about the conflict, seen from a step back. The Iran-US confrontation in the Gulf has reached a structural equilibrium that is uncomfortable for both sides, but tolerable for both sides. And the discomfort is not distributed where the decision-making power is. The people who are least powerful in this equation, Asian importers, Gulf seafarers, Yemeni civilians, bear costs that are real and measurable. The people who hold the key decisions, Trump, Khamenei, Xi, face the full political cost of changing the equilibrium and have consistently found that the status quo, uncomfortable as it is, costs less than the alternatives. The shadow fleet will keep sailing dark. The discount will keep varying with enforcement intensity. The IRGC will keep calibrating its Gulf posture to the revenue available. And the global oil price will keep pricing in the risk that none of this resolves cleanly. The question we want to put directly to you, and it is a real question, not a rhetorical one, is this. If you were advising planners on either side, which cost would you be more willing to swallow? Tighten the blockade hard enough to genuinely choke the cash, and accept the oil price spike that hits your allies and your own consumers while you pick a fight with Beijing over secondary sanctions enforcement. Or ease off, let the discounted crude keep flowing at current volumes, and accept that the IRGC's budget stays funded at the level it needs to maintain the pressure that justified the blockade in the first place. Both options bite someone who is not Iran. The question is who and how hard. Tell us your read in the comments, and then we're going to trace exactly where that money lands on the other end. In the next one, the tanker with no transponder signal will reach its destination. The cargo will be unloaded. The money will move through the intermediary chain. Some of it will reach an account that buys drone components, maintains fast boats, and pays the wages of the people who decide how dangerous the Strait of Hormuz is on any given night. That is the discount. And the discount is what neither side's strategy has managed to make disappear. If you have been following this channel, drop a comment. Which side do you think is actually closer to changing this equation, and why? We read everyone. And if you want to understand the other half of this, where the money lands and what it actually buys, that breakdown is coming. Make sure you're here for it.